fact, our earlier plan at NSI was to present a paper on contract workers in Delhi University. And that would have been, of course, very grounded, very concrete work, in some sense, which have complemented what Mukul presented to you about the happenings in Delhi University. That could not be completed in the time for this conference. So I took the easiest way out. Instead of talking about concrete and grounded things, talk about very abstract and general things. So I'm going to present a very broad thesis and try to convince you about its veracity in the given time I have. The thesis is that we are witnessing a very fundamental change. So witnessing a very fundamental change in the way universities work, and that's why we call it death of the university. So the thesis goes like, in the neoliberal political economy makes it impossible to have the idea of liberal university. Neoliberal political economy, I'm taking it as a particular way of organizing capitalist societies. So implication is that we are witnessing a very different form of organization of capitalist society in the past 20, 30 years. Some very basic changes are occurring in the way these societies are organized. And the other thing which I want to emphasize here is the idea of liberal university. Universities have been around since many centuries, millennia. The liberal university, the way we witness it, is a very recent phenomenon, hardly 2 centuries old. And furthermore, not the university as such, its idea, which I think has played a bigger role than the university itself. So the idea of university becomes impossible given the way our societies are going on. And implication of this hypothesis for, if you're worried about making a better word, I would say that free critical thinking now will be occurring more and more outside the university framework, which won't be a bad thing, because most of what we have, humanity has produced in cultural field, in the field of intellect, which can be said to be very valuable, whether it's Das Kapital or Newton's Principia Mathematica, or you can pick most of the literature and culture produced. It has been produced outside the university framework. It's again very, very recent that most of the intellectual activity in society is occurring within the university framework. And what I'm saying is that in future it's more and more likely that free critical thinking will be occurring outside the university framework. Now, what is the idea of liberal university? There's something very unique about learning, particularly higher education and learning process, which gels in very well with the idea of liberalism. Liberalism basically starts with a kind of ontological autonomy of individual as a person. So individuals are morally autonomous, they have some fundamental political rights, they have some inbuilt creative impulses, they have so that kind of idea of liberalism, which imagines human beings in a particular way, that somehow comes very naturally to the idea of sphere of education. Because education and learning, particularly higher learning, is a very individual process. But this is something which often you acquire while you're engaging, for instance, with a book, or while you're engaging just in a simple talk with a friend. So learning, pretty much like art, is a very individual-based process, unlike many other things in society which often occur in wider social networks. So that's what it seems that, as far as the liberal idea was concerned, to realize institutions and institutional structures which will realize these ideas, education institutions were perhaps the most right one, or the most appropriate one to realize this idea. So I can quote, for instance, what Wilhelm Humboldt, which is accredited with giving us the idea of a public university which is state-funded but which is self-regulated and autonomous. He, for instance, writes, if there is one thing more than another which absolutely requires free activity on the part of individual. So liberalism, of course, emphasizes the free activity of individuals as persons. So if it is one process which requires free activity, it is precisely the education. even much more than the art. So this idea of liberal university takes root within the liberal thinking in, let's say, early 19th century. And there are other things also occurring in society, changing in society. You could think about the Republic of Letters, the idea which Voltaire gives, and the bourgeois public sphere which emerges in the late late 18th and early 19th century and things like that, which in some, and other institutional structures, because most of the science, in fact, in 18th century also, 19th century also, occurred in what we call, societies. I mean, Newton was presenting his work not in Cambridge University, but to Royal Society. So a lot of this intellectual activity was taking outside the framework of state-regulated institutions, and they gradually galvanized to form what we call now public institutions. These institutions were autonomous and self-regulated. And just to give you an example what it means, universities like Delhi University, they are established by acts of parliament. Delhi University does not function under any Ministry of Government of India. Okay? Though it gets its funding through UGC, but it's not functionally under any ministry. It has its committees. Okay? So decision making in university like Delhi University structurally has to occur in committees which are supposed to make rational deliberations. Okay? And on that basis arrive at decisions. There is a very strong component of academic autonomy, because we have an academic council and then faculties and then executive council. So academic councils and the faculties, which are not under the control of executive council, they are supposed to look after the academic content of the university. So this idea that university would be self-regulated and it will internally will have intellectual autonomy, that is built into the structure of something like the university, and which is now being destroyed by the current administration, as Mukul just described. So that is something which university emerges as a social institutional structure. We also noticed after the Second World War in Western countries, there is a phase of mass liberal universities, where suddenly there is a large expansion in the number of student bodies in the universities. Enrollment ratios among the youth goes up to 20-30% and so on and so forth. And there's this kind of social explosion with that thing. Those societies just could not handle so many students in liberal universities. We have these anti-Vietnam struggles starting with students in the US, or it's 1968 of Paris. So there is mass liberal universities could not be sustained for so long, and there is internal crisis going in there. So this was a kind of idea of liberal university. But when we say this idea, I want to emphasize that it was an idea. Because in actual functioning in societies, these universities are playing some entirely different role. And I can quote, for instance, this is a French educationist who is talking about the education, what education does. He says it creates a gap difficult to cross, a gap between those who are in and those who are out. Okay? So higher educational institutions, they create a gap which is difficult to cross, and simultaneously unite on the level of equality all those who cross. So universities, liberal universities, the actual function in society was to create an exclusionary space. Okay? A space which was based on privilege. It is a space with limited access. So if you are in, you are privileged, you get markers of distinction, you get cultural capital. In India what happens, you get into bureaucracy, you get into hierarchies of society and things like that. So there's a very clear distinction which universities create in modern societies. Those who are able to cross over to the higher hierarchies, and those, the riffraff and the mass, which remains outside. That was a very important function of universities, even in their liberal phase. Another thing which universities does, and we all experience this, all of us are connected, most of us are connected to universities, they create networks. Networks of colleges alumni. In India, for instance, networks of IIT alumni. If you go and meet to the meetings of IIT alumni, or the college where I teach, for instance, there's a very strong networking. And the academic field itself is basically networking and nothing else. I mean, sociologists like Budo has actually talked about how Homo academicus creates a very distinct kind of social organization based on networking, and there's an idea of exclusion involved with it because the mass of the people, society is outside those networks. And it's indicative of, that networking in the field of university is there's very little sociology about it, except Buddha's work. So the self-reflexivity is not always easy to realize. So, if you take the case of India, because that's where I think we have to come to crux with, Indian universities in the post-independence period essentially became ways to establish or re-establish the hegemony of upper castes in the technocratic elite, as Naveen mentioned in his notes. Indian universities have been most reluctant to introduce affirmative action. We know that the reservation policy for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe teachers in University of Delhi or central universities came after the direct orders came from Ministry of HRD, and there was struggle by some teachers that you have to now implement the reservation policy in Delhi. On the other hand, in bureaucracy, the policy was going on for since independence. In the field of politics, in fact, it had, without any reservation, the oppressed caste has gained a foothold, and education sector, university sector in particular, was still, I would say, an area in which the upper caste still have a good stranglehold. I mean, they bring different arguments about merit and things like that. And by the way, only other institutions where there's no reservation is the Indian Army and Defense Forces. They don't have any affirmative action. Universities are the other set of institutions in India which are very reluctant to introduce affirmative action. So there was a reality of universities which was, when viewed from the point of view of the society at large, was very, very murky. Now, what happens with neoliberal political economy? As I mentioned that, it's a new phase of organizing society, and all of us know about neoliberalism. We think about market. So everything becomes commodified, it enters into market. Social welfare gets done through market, culture becomes commodified. But I want to emphasize certain other aspects of market. Markets are obviously there, but they are only one aspect of neoliberalism. In fact, most of the social relations in capitalist societies or even capitalist economy are not market-based relations. I mean, the labor process in which things get produced or services get produced, that's not a market process. Though labor is hired in a market, but the process of production is not at all market-based. So there are organizations, the methods of organization which emerge, during this current phase in the past 20, 30 years of capitalism, which I think are very important to understand what's happening to universities with us. Another thing which has happened in capitalism is the increasing role of cognitive labor. The ideologues of current system, they call it, that we have a knowledge society and things like that. But what actually is happening is that cognitive labor in the form of, information gathering, in the form of processing that information, in the form of problem solving, that is becoming more and more integral to the production of capitalist process. We know that, increasing, if you look at the share of R&D, research and development, which involves, product innovation of big corporations, over the time, the percentage of money spent on R&D is increasing, and in certain, industries like, software or computers or aerospace, that ratio could be as high as 20 to 30%. But on the other hand, a lot of work, even in shop floor, has a very high cognitive content. If you look at, for instance, a shop floor in Maruti car factory, old image of, Charlie Chaplin film of modern times, that a person is mechanically a part, as a kind of, his body becomes a part of a machine. That is no longer true. Because the nature of assembly lines, these nowadays in automobile industries, are very different. Okay? A worker, first of all, it's not that the same model is, it's not that only one model of the car is being built. On the same assembly line, a company might be building 20, 30 different models of the car. And a worker on the work site has to identify through computer chips, etc., what is required for that particular model. So that information has to be given to that worker. The worker has to access and process that information and then work according to that information. So what I'm trying to say is that the cognitive labor is becoming increasingly an important part of capitalist production process, and capitalism now needs highly trained workers. And that's where the role of universities come into capitalism. So that's one thing. Other thing which is happening in the capitalist organizational processes is that the internal management is taken up what can be called a corporatization role. And I view it is this way, that we have concentrated administrative powers, concentrated in individuals. That's one thing. But these concentrated organizational powers are between relatively autonomous organizations. So the old model of, you have, for instance, if you take General Motors, one of the largest corporations, public corporations, the old model in the 60s would have been very pyramidal. There's board of directors on the top, and then everything flows from the top to down. Now if you look at a lot of these organizations in which the way these are being managed, they are managed with different segments of the same entity, same capitalist corporation, but within that capitalist corporations, different organizations, they're not controlled from the top, but they are relatively autonomous. So that is one thing which I call the corporatization of the capitalist organization or production processes. Now what is happening in neoliberalism is that, and that's where we come to a very interesting idea, that things in capitalism, because it's a very complex society, it's not that one center or one idea can control everything what is happening. Things happen not because of some concrete planning, some strategy, or some conspiracy. Things happen due to various other kind of associational reasonings. For instance, my thinking is that the universities are going in a corporatization way, not because somebody has shown them that if the university administration goes to the idea of corporatization, universities will become more efficient in serving the needs of capitalism. I don't think nobody has actually shown that. So nobody has a proof that this corporatization would work better in fulfilling the needs of the capitalism. What is happening is that the so-called the intellectual elite in society, intellectual in the broader sense, not just in the academic intellectual sense, but the broader sense, the elite which takes decisions, for instance, that intellectual elite sees that within capitalist organizations, crises are being handled through this particular model of corporatarizations. Okay? And now when they say that there is a crisis in the field of education, just by analogy import that model. And that's what I think is largely happening, the way corporatization has penetrated into the domain of universities. Now just to give you an idea of what this new process is, how much time I have? Only 5 minutes. So to give you an idea of what is happening, I can take some quote from the Lisbon Declaration of System of Universities in Europe. And there are 3 things they are saying which is required now to prepare European universities for the challenges of what they call the knowledge society, which I basically think is nothing but a new form of capitalism. One thing which they are saying is that we need to introduce new governing structures and leadership. Again, very corporatist language which comes more from MBA courses, for instance, to increase the efficiency and competence. Okay, that's one thing. Second thing is, and that's very interesting, they want more autonomy for the universities. That is interesting because my thinking is that now capitalism is going about relatively autonomous organizational structure. So they are also demanding more autonomy for the universities. This autonomy is from basically central or state governments. Okay? So what they want in this autonomy, they want control of major assets such as estates and staff. So universities, administrations, they want greater control over staff and estates. It also implies readiness to be accountable both to the internal university community, which is both staff and students. Okay. Now let's be very clear, because a lot of these statements are ideological. They tell you half the story and they hide the other half the story. So as far as one part of autonomy is concerned, they are very clear. They want more control over staff and assets. And by the way, the National Knowledge Commission of 2006, it had recommended to the government of India that central universities, public universities are sitting on huge chunks of public land, which was given by the government, granted by the government. So as the JNU has a huge campus, right? And is right in the heart of South Delhi. If JNU was to sell the land which it owns, I mean, it can provide free education to not, currently it has 10,000 students, it can provide free education to 1 lakh students. The price of land run right outside JNU is so high. Okay. So by the way, the National Knowledge Commission had recommended that, these assets which universities control, why don't you sell this land and get a more commercial value out of it. So as it comes to autonomy, they're very clear. They want control over staff, they want control over estate. But when it comes to accountability to students and the staff, that's just a lip service. Because if you're very careful about accountability, they would have specified, okay, you want accountability of a democratic format, which for instance would be, involving students and teachers in major management decisions, creating institutional structures, which by the way, liberal universities already have. Because in academic council, for instance, how many teachers get elected? I think 15 teachers get elected, undergraduate teachers. In executive council also, 2 teachers get elected in University of Delhi. So we already have these committees which are democratic in nature. So if they were very serious about being accountable to students and staff, they could have actually mentioned, okay, we will be accountable under democratic institutional structures. That's not mentioned. So there's a lip service to the accountability part here. But more thing very interesting. And that's where I will end and say that, why the idea of a free liberal university becomes impossible under this regime. They talk about student-centered learning, a very good phrase, okay. The learning should be student-centered, right from, the kids go to nursery school to university, everything should be student-centered because, a child or an adult as a creative person should be center of the process. So the learning should be student-centered. But what does it mean? This involves an encouraging use of learning outcomes and being explicit about what graduates are expected to know. So something which is outside the graduate students, that decides what graduates are expected to know. And what outside that can be? Well, in the current situation, since the capitalism requires huge number of cognitive laborers, cognitive workers, so it's basically the requirements of the capitalist production process involving markets and things like that, which in some sense determine, okay, we want graduates which can do these kinds of jobs. So, it is something from outside the learning process, not just student-centered, it's something outside the learning process which decides what a student is required to know. Student and teacher are not free any longer to learn what they want to learn. And that's where, which Mukul was saying that how if free learning was such an enjoyable process at a very, individual, intimate level, that process of free learning is now practically impossible. Because the universities are not supposed to be centers of free learning as such, they are integrated so much into the requirements of capitalism or capitalism at this moment, that what happens in the university is completely different. So free learning is thrown out of the window. Then where is possibility of the idea of liberal university? Because liberal university gained the right of autonomy and self-regulation on the promise, on the claim that we engage in free learning. Man, free learning itself is not happening in universities. You throw away the idea of liberal universities also. That's not going to be happening here. So that's why I thought, that's how I will try to justify my thesis. Now my time is up, so I'll stop here. Other things we can discuss during questions.